record. Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I do apologize for the delay. We are half an hour late because we were experiencing technical difficulties, but alhamdulillah, we've got our connectivity. And we can start. So with that, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Before we begin, and I'd like to welcome you all finally to our talk called Pioneer Muslims in Canada with Dr. Murray Hogben. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies, and to acknowledge its significance for the Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live upon it, including its Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee roots, but also a significant Métis community and First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island. We are grateful to be able to live and learn, play and pray on these lands, to grow and interact with those of diverse backgrounds. And as a Muslim, I also acknowledge the responsibility given to us by Al-Khaliq, the Creator, to protect these lands and respect all who live on them. So once again, I do apologize for our delay because of our technical difficulties, but alhamdulillah, they have been rectified. So let's just dive in. I would like to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Murray Hogben, and of course, I know him as Uncle Murray. I grew up with him as Uncle Murray. So Dr. Murray Hogben was born in Toronto and grew up in Ottawa. In 1956, he became Muslim after meeting Alia Rauf, who he went on to marry in 1959. Dr. Hogben pursued a degree in journalism, joining the CBC in 1958, and in 1960, he became the secretary of the New Muslim Society of Toronto. After earning a doctorate in history from the University of Toronto and teaching history for a number of years, he then reverted to journalism, joining the Kingston Whig Standard in 1979, where he worked until retirement in 2000. And of course, that is the Uncle Murray that I know, the one that worked at the Whig Standard. He and Alia live on their hobby farm near Gananoque. They have 3 children and 4 grandchildren, but have raised generations of children in Kingston and from all over Canada through the camp that they have been running, Camp Almotmaneen, which is now known as Camp Dean. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Murray Hogben.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a conversation here. So what we've already talked about who Dr. Murray Hogben is. So Dr. Hogben has written a book, and if you see on my background, it's called Minarets on the Horizon, Muslim Pioneers in Canada. So I'd like to ask you, what are the origins of this book? Where did this idea come from, and where were the sources of the book?
Well, as you say, it was long involved in Islam really since really as soon as I became a Muslim virtually. But anyway, the sources were back in 1972. There was an organization, a national organization formed called the Council of Muslim Communities of Canada. It then some people suggested that as a whole lot of books were coming out in the late 1970s on the Greeks in Canada and the Poles in Canada and the Lithuanians in Canada, and even the Arabs in Canada, they ought to do one on the Muslims in Canada, because we were kind of not an ethnic silo, but a kind of a lateral group of all sorts of people. And so I got a small grant and went across a number of the provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and I think Nova Scotia, and quite a bit in Ontario. So I did a certain number of interviews in 1979 based on the idea that we were going to do a book on the social, economic, and historical situation of the Muslims in Canada. When all this got burnt in our house fire, a bad man burnt our house down, lost everything, but the stuff that survived in cyberspace that I had actually input or had somebody else type in for me suggested sort of nearly 40 years later that this material that I had given up on because it was just impossible to carry on with it without academic grants and so on. But it turned out that it looked like a lot of history because a lot of these people were in fact dead, people that I had known and grown up with or met across the country. So I thought, a history of Muslims in Canada, good idea. Then how do I go about that? And then I started doing interviews across the country with people that I found here and there, and backed up with the help of the late Daoud Hamdani's study of statistics Canada, the census reports and estimates that he did, because for 30 years or more, even longer, 50 years, the Census Canada didn't count the Muslims separately. So I worked on this stuff and eventually, alhamdulillah, produced this book.
And it must have been just for you to have lost or thought you had lost all of that data in the fire. How did that make you feel at the time?
Well, needless to say, pretty bad. It was pretty depressing. But as I say, it kind of phoenix rising out of the ashes, because our son-in-law, who works for Microsoft, was able to pull this stuff out of cyberspace somewhere. And this is before, I think, cloud and all that stuff. But anyway, and then I saw all this stuff and I thought, well, I owe a debt to those Muslims, those early Muslims, to get their voices out somehow. And this turned out to be the way to do it. So, and it kept sort of adding people in and adding information and working the whole thing into a kind of a nation, sea to sea kind of epic.
Mm-hmm. So in this research, after you were able to recover it and find all the information from your interviews, what did you do? What did you discover? I mean, I think from it's been a while that we tend to know what we think is the history of Muslims in Canada. So who exactly were they? Who were these first Muslims?
Yeah, it's really odd. And this is we owe this tremendous debt to the late Daoud Hamdani, who was an economist for the federal government. But he also started dabbling in statistics because he was once asked to make a speech on the Muslims in Canada, about which he really knew nothing. So he started digging around, and the story was that he's told me is in the book, I guess, because I interviewed him in relation to Memorial University and St. John's, Newfoundland. He was fishing around, and suddenly he came along across the line, and he asked somebody, he said, "Come on, what is this handwritten early thing?" And this was 1854, I think it was, and it said Mohammedan. And he asked his friend, he said, "Really, what does it say?" It says Mohammedan. He said, so he had discovered that by the time of that there were 3 Muslims recorded that he could find in 1854. In the 1871 census, which I guess is getting a little more, it's Canada now on its own feet as an independent country, more or less, that there were 13 of them, because there was a John and Agnes Love who came from Scotland, and they had a number of children. Then there was a family called Simon that came from New York State. And there was an escaped slave with a remarkable story by the name of Muhammad Bakwaka, who was enslaved and sent to Brazil, somehow escaped from a ship in Manhattan Harbor, and worked his way all the way up to Chatham, Ontario, and eventually apparently wrote an autobiography. So these are these very early people. But most of the people who started coming into the country in these 1850s and on, when we could start to track them at all, were Syrians, or kind of Greater Syria, part of the Ottoman Empire. And basically, largely from what's now Lebanon, but there were also some Ottoman Turks, some Albanians, and some Bosnians around the turn of the century who came in. But there was a scattering of people. I mean, if we look at that chart, which I should ask you if you can pull up that chart, you know, I have a copy, or maybe you've got it here. But just look at the top line there, you know, 1854, there are 3. In 1871, as these various families started having children, 13. 1901, the next time they were sort of available, 47. In 1911, there were nearly 800. But then after the First World War, the numbers dropped considerably. And then only very slowly started to recover. I mean, in 1951, there were 800. Now, in 1961, you see there are 5,800. So when I became a Muslim in, say, 56, 57, whatever it was, there were maybe 3,000 or 4,000 Muslims. And so that's why it's kind of a unique experience. But, and I should mention here that I'm using the term pioneer to distinguish between the people who came really before 1967, because 67, they finally deracialized and liberalized the Canadian immigration laws. So you can see from 71 compared to 1961 how the numbers just exponentially go up and up and up and up, all the way through to 2011, when that household survey, which is not terribly good, was more than 1 million. But you can see the numbers go up, and I'll explain that how the racial and legal situation changes. But it's you know, so when I was somebody who was really pioneerish in that sense, there was so few of us around. You know, a handful of us in Toronto could say our prayers on a couple of bed sheets, and that was it. You know, and that's Toronto, the capital of the country, virtually. Okay, let's go back to that. So, but the people who came to say, well, the Syrians, Lebanese, and so on, and other. I should mention also there were some Indians from the Punjab came to the BC West Coast just after 1900, and they came in and they seem to have pretty well universally gone into the lumber industry, where they still are. And you remember the famous case in 1914 when there was a shipload of these Punjabi Indians arrived in Vancouver or Victoria, one or the other, and they were held in the harbor for months because the British-oriented and rather racist immigration laws counted them as Asians. Secondly, they had not gone in a continuous passage from Calcutta, I guess, to Vancouver, because they had probably stopped off at Hong Kong or something on the way. The British said, good, you can't come in. And so the laws were really discriminatory. Because remember, the Canada kind of bent over backwards rather differently. And I'm sure a lot of people didn't agree, but in about 1911, 1913, they finally made a big pitch for immigration from Eastern Europe. And it's just Eastern Europe, you know, with the Poles and the Slovaks and so on and so on, because they wanted them as farmers and to expand the West. But Muslims or blacks or others were, you know, still not very welcome. I might jump on just to say that
okay.
After these immigration law changes in the 60s, especially 1967, with the point system, which says it doesn't matter where you come from, it's what you can bring to the country. You know, what skills you have, what language you have. And because of partition, and then, I mean, until between partition in 1947 of India into, you know, India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, I was saying this, they had quotas, and they allowed 150 Indians a year, 100 Pakistanis, and 50 Sinhalese. I mean, if that's not a racial quota, what is? But anyway, that all eventually faded in the 1960s, and they said, okay, you can come in from, not from, doesn't matter where you came from, but what can you do for us, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I imagine
a lot of Indo-Pakistanis who are highly educated, there's somewhere in here we've got to discuss the kind of difference between the early Muslims and the in the 1960s on, or 1950s on. I grew up with these people as a Muslim when we were such a handful in a place like Toronto, because then they started to get, instead of just being the Albanians, the Bosnians, and 3 Arabs and 1 African and 1 from Iran or something. There's a massive Indo-Pakistanis came in, highly educated professionals, graduate students, or at least students coming to study, professional. They spoke the language English. They were well educated. Whereas the poor Lebanese came in with unilingual Arabic, really uneducated about Islam and in what we call formal education. They came to make their fortunes and then go home. So they were coming as single, very young men, as you see in some of these stories we'll talk about, 12 or 14, etc. I mean, incredible bravery. They came over and they carved out livings and all that stuff in due time. Whereas the Indo-Pakistanis came then and very often brought wives, or rather soon married, whereas the Lebanese and the other Ottomans tended to not think they were staying. And then eventually they would get a wife, or from back home, or they would marry somebody here. Very few Muslim women, so they would tend to marry Aboriginal women or Ukrainians or other Canadians who were new like themselves. Next question.
That's very interesting. I was actually going to ask you you've got the early Muslims, and then you have that wave that came in when the doors of immigration were open to, and the students came. So in terms of the comparison, obviously the ones that are coming as students are coming to study, they're more educated. But what about that early set of Muslims? And then I imagine that there are also escaped slaves coming up to Canada from the United States, and maybe even Africans coming, and maybe Africans coming also as explorers or for trade as well. But I'm imagining that the lifestyle and the hardships that the people that came earlier were very significant compared to the ones that came in the 60s and 70s. And could you elaborate what kind of things were they doing? How were they making a living?
True. I mentioned already that the one escaped slave that we know about, and these other people, but when these Lebanese and Syrian Lebanese and the other Europeans like the Albanians and so on, and they tend to come in with little education or none. But what they did, it's amazing, and this is in a time before cell phones, telephones, anything, but they would arrive at New York or Montreal or Halifax. They would somehow contact some other earlier fellow Lebanese who would then say, okay, we have cousin so-and-so is in London, Ontario, or Edmonton, for goodness sake. And so they would set off with a huge bag of goods from a wholesaler, from either Jewish wholesalers or other wholesalers, and they would get this huge bag of stuff, and they would go peddling on the country roads, usually their way across the country, selling things and sleeping outside. And with the stories they tell, just a tremendous hardship. I mean, they would, because of the lack of language, they would arrive at the door on a winter night somewhere in Saskatchewan or goodness knows where, and knock on the door, and somebody would either say, well, come in, or who are you, whatever, or they might be greeted with a shotgun, or they might be say, well, you can sleep out in the barn there, or you can sleep on the veranda in the winter. Just dreadfully hard stories. But then they succeeded, most of them, and they would pedal and learn the language bit by bit, and then they would. Our printer's going off. I have no idea by itself. It's the gin. This is the gin and the printer. Anyway, they would then, get a horse and cart. And the man on the cover of the book, which you've got there, is a guy, Muhammad Asif, I think of his name. He is shown in the 1930s with his horse and cart out west, peddling a box which looks like a pizza box, but is probably, various interesting things. to farmers in a farmer's barnyard. And so they would sell things, then they would get a horse and cart, then they would set up a store, or they would go into trading with the Indians in the far north. All these kinds of varied things. And then they would go into business, and they might often open an auto dealership, goodness knows what, in the most remote kinds of places, or little outports in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and what do you call it, New Brunswick, and so on. I mean, I haven't explored it all. This is really just an initial book, but I want to get live people that I could actually go as far back, or they could tell me about their antecedents who turned up here in the 1890s or the 1910s or something.
So does that mean that a part 2 of this book is coming?
No, I don't think I'm got that many years ahead that I can do it. Oh, but I would love to, and I know how to do it. I'd add in more women for various reasons. The people whose things that I initially typed were people I often knew, and most of them were men, except for a remarkable woman, which I should really mention to you, because they started. I mean, I have Lac La Biche is one. I mean, Lac La Biche is way up, 500 miles north of Edmonton. It is way off in the snowy wilderness, and they arrived there at Lac La Biche about 1901 or something. And the guys said, and I interviewed these people, which is remarkable. Some of these people were very old then when I got them out in Edmonton or in Lac La Biche. But you know, there was the RCMP officer and the missionary and you know, the Arab trader kind of thing. Remarkable. So they started off, and I could read you a little clip of, whatever, you know what I mean.
An excerpt.
Yeah, whatever is it. Yeah, Alex, there's a guy who's made it very well for himself, called Alex. He became Alex Hamilton, but his name was Ali Ahmed Asif Abu Shadi. Again, a Lebanese, no education, etc. He was born about 1891, came to Canada about 1905, when he was either 12 or 14. The dates are always fuzzy, because one of the things about the Lebanese and Syrians is that they were escaping two things. One, poverty in the Bekaa Valley especially, and secondly, the Ottoman draft. The army draft was a terrible thing. So if they could lie about their, I mean, the parents would lie about their ages, that they were really much younger and therefore not suitable for the draft. And ideally, they would get out of the country somehow. So this Abu Shadi said, I'll let you just a little clip here. I left the old country when I was 12 years old in 1905. My uncle Hussein Abu Shadi was coming to America along with 14 others. At that time, I was herding cattle about 2 miles out of town, a place called Lala in the Bekaa. And we heard about Canada having a lot of gold, the Yukon gold. So I left the cattle with a friend to go and say goodbye to my uncle. And I said, look after them because I won't be long. I went running and running. And when I caught up with him, it was almost a mile. And I asked if I could go with him to see Beirut. I hadn't been to Beirut, and he said, okay. I heard them talking about Canada and saw the ocean from the top of the mountains in Beirut, as you can, and I asked if I could come along. He said, yes, but I had no passport, clothes, or anything. So we went to Marseille, and at that time, the British government, were hard on the Arabs, the Muslims, the Christians too, and the Jews, because we were business people. They would inspect our eyes and say, no good, no good, no good. They picked my uncle, and when they came to me, they said, that some other people that said, that's his nephew. So they took 3 of us out of the 15 and said, you other boys can go home because your eyes are no good to go to Canada. The rest were told they could either go to South America or go back home. And so they came to Montreal and just struggle, starting these little, these sort of trading posts up there. And this is all without communication, but the next one is, I think, really interesting. One of my favorite ones. In Edmonton, there was a woman again, I was able to interview her again in '79. They've all gone long ago, bless them. Her name was Hilwy Hamden. Her married name was Hamden, married in Ali Hamden. Anyway, she was born in, what is it, 1900 something, pretty early on. And she came to, this guy Hamden came from Canada, where he was, up in the north, came to Lebanon, married her. They went back to Fort Chipewyan. She was 16 years old. And she said she cried for the first 2 years. I mean, it was pretty awful for her anyway. But she had 6 children, which may have added to it. But eventually, she got along with people and settled in. And he was doing very well. So then she had a nurse and all sorts of other things. One of the stories is that the Catholic missionary said she was going to go to hell because she wasn't a Christian, she wasn't a Catholic. But she said, another one said, I was a very nice person and I would probably go to heaven. But this kind of thing. But anyway, she, I won't put more time into that given the kind of squash of time here. But
but I think this one's an important one.
Yeah, well, she got to Edmonton, and then they started talking about building a mosque or a community center of some sort. And this was, again, about 20 people, but there's nobody there. There are no Muslims around. So she said, no, God's told me that we want to have a mosque. We don't want to have a community center. And she managed to win people over. And then she was able to get all sorts of people to drive her all over the West to other these scattered Arab traders here and there, raising money. And they built this thing in 1938, built and designed more or less by this Ukrainian, who didn't know what a mosque looked like, and neither did they really. So it's a kind of a church with 2 kind of little minarets with domes on the top. But then, and there were no more mosque buildings until London, Ontario. Again, a large number of Lebanese basically had settled there, and they did that in 1956. And then Laklabish started their little one again with little minarets and little domes on the top. 57 and when is the next one? I can't remember. But they kind of went on, and then in Toronto we started our little Islamic Center in 60 or 61, and Ottawa got its in I think 72, something like that. Anyway, they go on, mosque building, of course now they're everywhere, but in those days there was nothing around at all. So it's quite a saga how they got these things built. And in Quebec, for example, I mean, to show you, and Quebec is still in the news because of its as they say, systemically racist background, despite Legault's opinion. They couldn't get religious status to be recognized as a religion until 1965. And I've got a photograph in the book of these guys, and I've interviewed one of them. And they went off to Quebec City as a little delegation with their lawyer who had got this thing set up, and they got a private member's bill to say that Muslims actually exist and should have rights and so on, because they couldn't bury people, they couldn't marry anybody. You had to get married with a minister, a Christian minister was the only person who gets you married. So that was in 65. So this pioneering business, I mean, you can see it's pretty rugged for a long time.
So that's quite interesting in terms of, you mentioned that, Quebec is still suffering. And I think you've seen that rise of Islamophobia, because now we're naming it as Islamophobia. So with your own experience as a Muslim in the 50s and 60s, but then with all the accounts that you hear, that you have researched, and if you've heard from these people that were here much earlier, do you think, how has that changed? I would imagine that at the beginning, it was just people were ignorant. They didn't know anything, whereas now they do know. So, but has the behavior towards Muslims,
I'll tell you,
how would you say that's evolved?
Well, I mean, I never remember suffering things from being Muslims particularly, but there were stories. One of the interesting people that I've got there, and again, went to Iran with him in 1980, but Salim Ghanibet, he said when he was a small boy, he was born in a sod hut in Saskatchewan in about 1910, a real sod hut. This was real pioneer farming that his father was doing in between bouts of trading. And there was a new teacher, and the teacher was asking, what's your name? What's your name? What's your name? Came to him and said his name was Salim. So she said, oh, that's nice. What's your nationality? So he said, it's Syrian. So she said, what's your religion? And he said Mohammedan, because they didn't know to say Muslim. And she went like that, because of the Turks had this terrible reputation, the First World War, et cetera, and all the kids fled. And he said, he used to laugh. And he said, well, it took them some days before they came back and sat with me. So sometimes they were at gunpoint, and other times they were welcomed. Muhammad Afsar, who did a lot of work in the Muslim community in Hamilton and then the Swift Current in 1980, getting the mosque really built there. But he said Islamophobia, for him, the minister of a church came to offer them space, walk them through to saying, would any of the space you'd like to use? And we understand that you don't like pictures of Jesus and so on. We'll cover those over for your prayers and everything. I mean, so he said, there's all this individual back and forth. People had different stories, good stories, bad stories.
Yep,
And
and actually we see that here today. There is a Catholic high school here that has provided space in their chapel for the Muslims to pray with covering the images, providing prayer cloths for the people who may not have their scarves. Or so it's true, you have all kinds of people that behave in different ways, and hopefully I hope that most of them are the kind and good and generous ones, that it's more about a matter of being ignorant, but the behavior doesn't come out as a negative. But I do realize that in some of those stories that you talked about with respect to being held at gunpoint, and it was quite dangerous. And I think of the stories that you're telling in terms of the boy who is 12 or 13, and Hilmi coming here when she was 16 or 17. Those are the ages of my children, and I can't even imagine them doing that.
Yeah,
So
one of Najat Hassan in London, Ontario, where a lot of these, but she knows about her family and and we were talking about these other things, and she says in her interview, she cannot imagine, her 14-year-old children setting off and landing in Argentina and eventually getting up to Canada. I mean, just the amount of guts and effort they must have made. I do want to mention the Kingston people before. I don't know how we're doing with your questioning.
I was just going to go there.
let me jump quickly then. The first person who got here was in about 1958, a urology student at the time, Dr. Fuad Shaheen, now recently deceased. But he came from Turkey because he said he wanted to come to Canada because this was the land of Lester Pearson, who was very impressed because of his handling of the Suez crisis and so on. So he came to Hotel Dieu Hospital here in sunny Kingston, and the nurses were so good to him that when he was fasting, for example, they said, no, nobody touched that food. That food's especially for Dr. Shaheen. They're always looking after him all the time. And he did very well. Then in 1960, another gentleman, Imtiaz Azhar, came in 1960 as a German trained, he'd come from India with a chemical degree, training in Germany, arrived because CIL really needed somebody. He came and worked here for some years, and when he was selling off to go home to India to marry, he there was an ad for his paper, and Dr. Mustafa Fahmy saw the ad and they met. So here were the first two Muslims in India meeting over the sale. They're kind of passing in the night, as it were, like ships. But anyway, so then Dr. Fahmy came in, and he had been studying in the States, and he had a PhD in electrical engineering, really wanted him apparently, because they didn't have very many PhDs at Queen's, would you believe? And so he started organizing little Friday prayers and so on, and then regular prayers, which he got the university to provide them some space. I mean, some really good stories about starting this whole business off in Kingston. And then the other couple of people, the other person I might mention is Khalil Baksh. Now, he had come to Canada in the late 50s to Winnipeg. Then he got a teaching degree there, or science degree. Anyway, he became a teacher of the Correctional Service of Canada, and eventually ended up coming to Kingston in the 80s or so. I had met him already in 79 in London and earlier through the CMCC, but the Council of Muslim Communities of Canada. But those are the kind of really early people. Unfortunately, your father, for example, or Dr. Muhammad Bayoumi, all kind of came after my kind of 1967. I had to stop somewhere, and 67 seemed to be a good thing in that that's when things take off numerically. So a lot of people are left out, to my great regret, as were a lot of women who I should have interviewed, but you can't, I can't do everything in one lifetime or late lifetime.
Well, but I think also, you've sort of began the journey. So even if you can't, or you don't see yourself doing the second half, I'm sure there will be others in
Inshallah.
Canada that will take the
Inshallah.
reins,
Yeah.
inshallah, and
Yeah.
keep it going, because it's so important
Yeah.
to know our own histories, especially for the generations to come, to know what a long history that we have in
Yeah.
Canada. The one that we know, and then the ones that we have yet to discover.
Yeah.
Because who knows when the actual first Muslims came
Yeah. Yeah.
to Canada.
There is an archives being started at the University of Toronto, the Institute of Islamic Studies, and they're forming an archives of, I forget what the initials are, but an Islamic history of Canada kind of archives. I didn't have anything to give them, of course, because everything that I'd lost everything in the fire, except the interviews that I was actually doing or had. So, but it is a going concern, and people are making an effort to do it, and there will be, inshallah, more history written about Muslims in Canada.
Inshallah. So, as we get to the end of our conversation, what final words would you have in terms of what did you come out of after doing all of this research and looking at how Islam has evolved in Canada, North America? Um, where's the last page of this particular
Well,
chapter?
I was reading my own last pages just for a little while ago while we were waiting for the technical glitches to remind myself what I thought. But basically, this incredible story of the struggle and persistence of these early Muslims who had nothing to. I mean, there was no safety nets at all except for family and friends, kind of thing. But they did persevere, and then once they began to think, well, I'm not just going to come here to make $25,000 and go home. Maybe I've got the store, and maybe I should get a wife, and maybe we should have some children, and we need a cemetery, and we need a mosque, and so that's the way it developed. Starting as I say except for that early 1938, but that was the impetus of these things, and so there is a struggle and perseverance of these people that's really important. I think they have done remarkably well. But one of the things that I mentioned in this, my conclusion, is that I think the history of Muslims in Canada, like Islamic History Month, is important because it's a kind of litmus test. If Canada accepts us and understands us and comes to terms with Muslims, then that's a good thing. It says good things about Canada. If it doesn't, then that's kind of sad because it indicates it's not as liberal and thoughtful a country as we thought. The other thing is that I think Muslims also have to help in this because their acceptance is going to be based on also them being able to get along with the rest of Canadians. If they insist on this and they insist on that, or they shut themselves off and insist on wearing clothes that they wore in a homeland, umpteen years before, these kind of little irritations are going to cause us problems. But there was one woman I should have mentioned, didn't have time, Eva Wahab, a wonderful woman in Ottawa, again, now to say, they're all gone, right? But she said there wasn't a day that she didn't get down on her knees and say, thank God for being born in Canada. Because she said when her father arrived, again, the same thing, he set up a little shop, and I did some peddling, and then I set up a shop in Hull, I guess, from Gatineau across from Ottawa. but said that we were all a bunch of big people. We were French Canadians and Arabs and English Canadians and Jews and various people. We all got along. Nobody cared about anything. We were all, fairly poor, but just working together. And she said it worked out, and they were great. And so those early days in particular did have their blessings. There's some neat stories, but again, you have to read the book because we don't have time to talk about it. But thank you very much for this so far. Any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
Yes, I don't see if anybody has any questions who are on the Zoom, please feel free to put them in the chat. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, please feel free to put it in the comments. I did put a note there. I think what we've experienced is that a lot of people tend to watch it on their own time, but I will keep an eye on the chat, on the comments, even after we finish. So if there's any comments, I can ask you and get back to them maybe via email. This is the thing where we've become very reliant on technology and internet and getting things on our own time. But there is also there is something about being together at the same time and asking the questions directly, I think. So I'm just going to give it a few more minutes to see whether we have any questions. And for those of you on the Zoom, if Dr. Hogben agrees, after we've finished the live stream and stopped recording, I'm sure there are some people who would just like to catch up and have some conversations with you if people want to stay
Sure,
a few minutes. But it doesn't look like there's any questions happening right now. So with that, I would just like to say Jazakallah khairan to you, Dr. Murray Hogben, Uncle Murray. To
Murray,
me,
please.
I will always call you. I will always call you Uncle Murray.
That's fine, but the doctor, forget that. Long time ago.
Sometimes we have to say that. You've done the Muslim community a huge service, and the Canadian community a huge service in putting these stories, compiling these stories, putting them down in print so that they can be read for generations to come. I don't know if I guess I'm thinking this is the first time that somebody has done this with respect to the Canadian Muslim experience. And like I said, this is probably you've opened the door, and hopefully somebody will take the reins and continue this work so that somebody will write about the Muslims in the 2020s during COVID and how they so hopefully it is
other gloomy subjects.
Other gloomy subjects and the good the experiences that we had in Kingston with respect to going to the picnics in Grass Creek Park, and then we would always go to your farm to have dessert and ride ponies. I think those are the memories that people need to remember.
I found one of us saying prayers outside. I don't know the Dr. Fahmy leading, but there was a picture of the garden. We did survive the fire for various reasons. But anyway, and there was a line of people out in our garden, and I think probably Dr. Fahmy or Dr. Bayumi or Hafiz, somebody leading. You couldn't see because they're kind of backs, but it said, there it is,
But yeah, there's a lot of good stories in Kingston and in Canada. I think that we could all generations now and in the future can learn about how everybody worked together to build the communities that are here today. So Jazakallah khairan for opening that first chapter of this history. And we really do appreciate all that you've done and for participating in Islamic History Month this year. I'm just going to take a few minutes just to tell you about some of the other events that are happening. First and foremost, we are having holding a food drive during this month. It's called the Feed a Neighbor from Your Table food drive. And this is because the theme for this month is actually multicultural flavors of Muslim cuisine. And in keeping with this focus on food, we chose to have a food drive for our local food bank. We hope that other communities are doing the same. And what we've tried to emphasize is that when you're choosing foods to donate, try to think about what you have on your own table and donate that type of food, because we are a diverse community, which means that the people that are using the food bank are also a diverse. I mean, it is our community that there are people in our community that are using the food bank. For example, gluten-free, low sugar, no sugar for people that are diabetic, food from diverse cultures. Not everybody is used to eating pasta. I personally love pasta, but it's not something that everybody is used to. So, and people want to eat what they're familiar with. So think of what's on your table. And when you're donating it, you don't have to, but just when you're making those choices, consider donating the same type of food for your neighbors. And that will be happening until the end of the month. And of course, you can always donate to the food bank. You don't need to have a special month to do that. Tomorrow, MSGP is having a fun event. It doesn't have to do with food. Let's see if I can get this to go. So they're having a Ms. Marvel watch party in Dupuy 215 from 6 to 7:30, and there will be food there. So I guess that's going with our theme. And there will be a discussion following the watch party with Dr. Sailaja Krishnamurthy and Dr. Adnan Hussein and Dr. Shabana Xavier on Islam, comics, and superheroes. So if you don't know, Ms. Marvel is a Muslim Pakistani American teenage girl who all of a sudden comes into superpowers. So there's a whole comic book series about that, and they've created a series on Disney Plus. So there'll be some discussion about that after watching that. So if you have some time and you're on campus, you might consider checking that out. But do think about donating to the food bank as well. And there are other events happening both on campus and in the city. So just look at our website, which is our Facebook page, which is IHM Kingston, to see what's going on next and to provide us with any suggestions for next year, inshallah. So without it further ado, once again, Jazakallah khairan for everybody for listening to Uncle Murray for participating and sharing the stories that he has with us. It's always great listening to your stories. With that, I will just officially close before I stop. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay.